So
Yeah.
Michael, in our last conversation, this idea of a practice of beginning came up, and I think it was something that struck a chord with both of us. So do you want to kind of unpack that a bit, explore that idea a bit?
So, it came up about a year ago, and I I've been thinking about practice for a long time, thinking about studying and practicing for probably the last 20 years in a variety of ways. But I was doing experimenting with the design of small group work and gatherings, and I wanted a way of bringing people into the idea of developing a practice, of not introducing them to an existing, practice which already had an orthodoxy and a structure, but introducing the idea of practice as a part of how we think, how we work, how we navigate life. Um, and, you know, because there was this idea of initiating, the phrase just came to me in my head one day, a practice of beginning. And I liked the feel of it right away. Partly because, as long as I've been studying practice, I feel like a perpetual beginner. I feel
Beginner's
in
mind.
some ways like there are any number of practices that I've studied and been interested in, which I've never really started in some way or other, and yet feel like I've had some meaningful engagement and encounter with. And I knew, I mean, I knew that bringing the idea to you, I knew that I suspected it would resonate with you for a bunch of reasons. Some of them being the ones that attracted me or brought it up for me in the first place, but also because, just most proximately thinking about your experience with improv. Um, it seems to me anyway, as a neophyte and distant student of improv too, it seems to me the beginning is always a thing coming up in improv.
Yeah, and
The pro
it's funny because to me, as always, improv connects to the sounds of complexity, which is just the way my mind works. And I think, yeah, beginnings really matter. They matter at the beginnings of scenes when
Yep.
in an improv scene, you have to create something that people can even be willing to watch. And there's certain things kind of around how you create and hold a space that something can happen with. So there's that piece. And in complex adaptive systems, there's this idea of sensitivity to initial conditions. So where
Okay.
you begin makes a huge difference. And so it kind of matters when you're holding or starting any complex adaptive process, like any workshop or any retreat or anything like that. It's quite the analogy people often use is if you're a drop of water that falls on the Andes, you can fall a kind of tiny distance one way or the other, and you end up either in the Pacific or the Atlantic, depending
Right.
which side of that cusp you fall. And so precisely where you start kind of makes a whole realm of things possible. It doesn't determine them. It doesn't determine the outcome before you even start, but it determines or shapes a whole kind of range of outcomes. So there's that piece. And the other thing I think is really interesting is, one of my favorite mantras, which comes up in meditation and meditation improv, obviously lots of connections as well. Um, uh, the idea of begin again, that you can always begin again. And
Mm,
there was a
mm,
piece I
mm.
wrote about that a few years back when I realized, in the middle of a bad day, I can always just go, hey, why don't I just mentally begin again? And I suppose then the last thing that struck me about it was the sort of what sounds paradoxical, but actually I think is really rich, is the idea that actually we're also always in the middle of everything. So we don't ever get to completely start again. We're in the middle of our lives. We're in the middle of a whole series of events at all levels of scale. And yet somehow that seems to go with beginning again, that it's a kind of an attitude or a kind of sense that all we can deal with is what we've got right here. And that's kind of in the thick of things, but it's also always the possibility of a new beginning. And so I don't know, it just struck me that for all of those reasons, this phrase, like for you, it really kind of resonated. And I suppose for me, it's not that I have a sharp idea of what that is. It's more that I'm curious about what could that be and what would a
Yeah, yeah,
practice
yeah.
at the beginning look like. And And it just struck me that the it just made me laugh. It did then, it does now. Well, the way to begin then would to be to begin, right?
Right,
So
right.
um rather
No,
than
well,
plan what we're gonna do.
again, I mean, one of the reasons why I had an instinct to bring it up with you was because I hoped it away for just that reaction. Because I also, even though I've been thinking of it for a while, I still, it's not a filled in idea for me, right? It's not like I haven't worked it all out, and in fact, to the contrary, I've deliberately not worked it all out, because, in part, both what I want out of it for myself, but also what I think it could offer to others isn't something that's already worked out, right? That is, I love that phrase, eating your own dog food, but a concept that eats its own dog food, right? I mean, that is really true down to the bottom, to the concept of beginning, linking to, one of the things you said about us always beginning things. So I mean, as a practical matter, um, you know, I had also been doing a lot of thinking about kinds of things that we are always beginning, and that we often, fuck up because we never quite get out of beginning them, right? I mean, meetings, are an example. We can spend an hour of an hour-long meeting, starting to get ready to have the meeting, and then it's over.
Yeah, I've been in those
Right.
meetings. Huh?
And at the same time, we're always, in our work, in our lives, at the beginning of new things, or trying to begin new things, often with others, and as we're doing them with others, we're always coming into the thing, as you said, not only in the middle of our own, of things, but in the middle of our own things, right? I mean,
Mm.
again, I did an experiment with a group of people, in Brooklyn about a year and a half ago, and I'd invited people to a very sort of nebulous, um, gathering, in which I proposed to, give them a class about the unnecessary, the idea of the unnecessary, and I described, maybe in a few sentences what that might be, and so, I expected people to show up, with, first of all, vague notions of what that might be, but also, bringing with them whatever they were in, and that somehow that was also going to be a part of, what we got into is what we're bringing with us as we step into something. Um, and I remember when we were talking last week, it occurred to me that that's something that I had written about, which is familiar, I know, to you, and will be to some others, which is this idea, that was instituted at Amazon, that meetings should begin not with presentations or PowerPoints and so on, but they should begin with a memo, written by the person who called the meeting, and that memo should take no longer than something like 30 minutes to read, and that each meeting begins with everyone present or participating reading the memo,
Mm.
so that everybody, is in some sense on the same page, from the start. And, as we were talking about it, and I was, it's sort of coming to me as I was describing this to you, that again, one, this struck me as a tool, that we might think of as part of a practice of beginning, and that one of the things the tool makes possible, not automatically, again, the practice is what makes these things possible, is, one, because we're all reading the same thing at the same time, that is bringing us into a common present in some sense, right? It's
Mm.
giving us a common present. And at the same time, the act of intentionally reading and thinking about something is also at the individual level making us present, preparing us to be present. And that both of those things are really powerful, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and there's nothing automatic about the fact that they're going to happen and going to happen in a strong way just because you create the
Mm.
tool or occasion for them to happen. But it does strike me that the tool, in its best use, is precisely a tool in aid of a practice, an ongoing practice.
It's
Um,
funny as I listen to you, I realize, you spent 3 years running groups online for Yellow, so small groups that would meet repeatedly, and more by paying close attention than by conscious design. We developed a ritualistic beginning that had certain kind of beats each time, a check-in which
right.
was both repeated but also novel each time, and a response to the chit chat as people came in. So I had this kind of ritualistic patterned, almost scripted element to it. Which I think was important to help people kind of settle in, and over time meant they could settle in to the present, as you just said, and come from wherever they'd come from and allow them to arrive in this virtual space. But if I think about it more deeply, Alex and I designed over 200 of those sessions, each one which was kind of individually prepared. But when I stopped to think about that, I realized actually all we designed was a beginning. So when I say we
Right.
designed the sessions, what I
Yeah.
mean is we'd have an idea about a start point, we might gather some stimulus, we might have a question. But it was only to get the group going. And sometimes they would do things with that we didn't anticipate. Sometimes we would do something completely different because something occurred in the first few minutes that meant that what we had imagined
Right.
was no longer relevant or wasn't perhaps the best thing to do. And I think the times where it worked least well was when we got over elaborate, and we developed this language, which was that of intricacy, where if we developed a very detailed, we do this and then we do that and then we do that and then half of them do this and half of them do that. Actually, then those sessions worked much less well. And so I kind of suppose where I'm left wondering is like maybe from a facilitation point of view, all you should ever have is a practice of beginning, and the rest should be responding. That actually, the same happened to me last week in Paris, where, I did one session that was kind of planned, but then I was due to do another session, and myself and the program directors were just kind of watching and waiting for what was the thing that kind of needed to happen, and then
Yeah.
actually it just happened very easily. So we just had a beginning and then some openness. So I'm just curious about that as well. Maybe that a practice at the beginning is all you need.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you're making me think of was the difference between something that works in this way, as you were describing, as you and Alex designed these yellow sessions, and as I've designed some things, including these overlap retreat gatherings and some more recent gatherings that I've designed. But as you're talking, I was thinking about, the difference between that and a class, where you're teaching a thing. And then I was remembering, that you, of course, studied as an undergraduate at Oxford and at New College, where I was lucky to spend a summer back in 1988, and was introduced, briefly to the whole tutorial, pedagogical method, which, is not very common in North America. And um, and so, in many of my classes, what was going to happen in class was very settled. It was settled by the planned lesson, and the job of the teacher, professor, was to walk you through the lesson, um, and less, as was my experience, limited experience with the tutorial method, where when prepared by either reading something or writing something and coming prepared to explore the thing with your tutor. And again, that feels also like a practice which always is a practice of beginning.
Yeah, it's funny the tutorial. I mean, I think the tutorial method has changed and evolved. It's got quite an interesting history, which I won't go into
Right.
now. But it came from Oxford University's failings, if you like. They've claimed it as a benefit, but actually it came from the fact that the lectures were dull. But you put me in mind of I remember once crossing the lawn at New College, heading to a tutorial with Jonathan Glover, who was our moral philosophy tutor, and I was a bit late, and so I'm kind of starting to run across the lawn or walk fast anyway, and then out of the corner of my eye, I see someone else walking quite fast. And as it comes closer, I realize it's Jonathan. And he turns to me and he's a very mischievous man and said to me with a glint in his eye, he said, "Oh, are we late for our tutorial?" And I suppose looking at it that way, you kind of go, the tutorial had already begun because,
Right.
you know, as a moral philosopher, he's contemplating, who was the promise, who held the promise between us, who promised who what to who, if we were
Right.
both there on the lawn and he was raising that question, we'd already begun.
Right.
But certainly, yeah, if in an Oxford tutorial, I mean, it would be a woeful dereliction of duty for a tutor to let somebody read their essay from beginning to end. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
for them to take issue with it and for you to then defend your ideas as best you can, and to use that as a springboard or a start point to explore the terrain that's of relevance and interest. So, again, very similar, perhaps no coincidence then that yellow ended up being something kind of similar. Um, and how powerful that is, because as a kind of engine of learning, it means that you're making your own connections, you're finding your own leads, you're finding your own points of interest, you're following the energy that you kind of have. Whereas in a class where there's a curriculum or an agenda, you're following something which by definition has been decided already by someone else, which
Right.
it may have value in some circumstances, but is not very energizing.
Yeah, well, you make me think of the fact that recently I was describing to someone my relationship to Buddhism, which is interested but uneducated, maybe is one way of putting it. And I describe myself as a lazy Buddhist. Someone again who doesn't have a strong practice or a strong education or literacy. And the person who's a serious Buddhist, sort of looked at me and said, like, that's actually really good.
Pretty Buddhist.
The lazy Buddhist, because the idea of holding too tight to the idea, which belongs maybe to other traditions of a doctrine or right, something that you ought to know already before starting, where in fact, again, one of the things that now, as I've had this lens of the practice of beginning, that I've started to realize shows up all the time in all practices, is they're all always beginning, right? I mean,
Well,
from
it's hilarious you mention that because my friend who is also a kind of very, very, I don't know what the word is, experienced Buddhist, he received Dharma transmission a long time ago, let's say that.
right,
So technically that makes him kind of as Buddhist as you can get, right? If you've
right.
had Dharma transmission. And I noticed hanging out with him once that he would also refer to Buddhists in the third person. And I challenged him on this. I said, what would you say a Buddhist would say, or the Buddhists think? And he looked at me and he said, well, now, it wouldn't be very Buddhist to claim to be a Buddhist, would it? And I was like, oh
Right,
God, this is a mindfuck.
right, right, right,
And
right.
and actually it puts me in mind as well of a practice of Tai Chi that my wife and I did when we lived in Argentina, where we used to go to these classes that lasted 3 hours or something. And my wife had been doing it for a year, and then I kind of joined later when I moved to Argentina. And I remember in my very first class having this kind of epiphany, which in terms of sensation rather than ideas or thoughts or anything like that. And Marcela, who was the name of the teacher, she used to describe these as gifts. And and so I was kind of like, oh my God, I just started this and I'm like, I've got it already. I've nailed it. And but what she was at pains to point out was that the gifts come and they go. They're given and sometimes taken away. And so in that sense, there's not a kind of linear, reliable, predictable progression. There are moments which of lucidity, if you like, or of clarity, but they don't necessarily accumulate. So and that I feel is a bit like the Buddhist thing as well. That this kind of, you're always beginning, you're always open. Some things arrive, some things don't, some things come, and that is, but there is a practice there somehow that makes those things more possible,
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that brought me to a certain again way of thinking about how how important beginning even for somebody with a deep practice or a strong sense of accomplishment or mastery, how important beginning remains, right? And so, I was thinking about, in this case, about tennis, and um, and I was thinking, about two things. I had a couple of different times had tennis lessons when I was young, um, and I've always loved the game. I've never been really very good. I did always have the sense, I've always had the sense through my life that I could have been good. Um, and and but I didn't stick with the practice. Um, and and that said, the thing that we know about the most accomplished people in that game, think of an example, your favorite, um, that person, whatever their gifts or talents or privileges, advantages in being in their journey to playing the game, none of them gets off the hook of practice, of doing the work. None of them could be the player they are and were without having done the work. And unfortunately, the word work, for a lot
Yeah.
of us is colonized by labor type work rather than the sense of practice. But again, it does for me in that example get at, hey, when you are even at the best of something with deep experience, um, that does not get you off the hook of going out onto
Well,
the court and hitting balls and, practicing your
yeah.
strokes.
Yeah, and
On.
there was one of those commencement or graduation addresses done recently by Roger Federer. I can't remember where, and he made a really, really interesting point. So he's, clearly he's won more tennis games than almost anybody ever, more championships, more titles, more tournaments. But he poses this question to the audience. He says, "So, what percentage of points in my entire career, if you add them all up, do you think I've won?" And I think I'm correct in saying, that the reveal is 54%. If it's not
Mm.
54, it's 52 or 56. It's
Mhm.
slightly more than half, and that
Right.
doesn't feel kind of right. And he goes on from there and makes a number of points, but the one that's germane here is the idea that the last point is now history, that the only
Mm.
point you're ever playing is this point, and that
Mm.
all you have to do is win 54% of this point. You have to win this point
Right.
54% of the time. And so I think tennis is a great example. I'm also absolutely hopeless at tennis, but I think there's a purity about it as a sport, partly because it's individual most of the time anyway, and because there is this the great players, they are always beginning. Each point of every single game is a new beginning, and I think that's part of how they manage to turn games around from really unlikely positions.
100%. And again, I'm sure there were people who might have other ideas about this, but it strikes me, you said tennis is an individual sport, and one of the ways in which I would really push that is, you know, it appears that there are two players competing, right? But in fact, each player is playing not on their own. It's true, but they really are the person against whom they are competing, right?
Yeah.
And if you watch tennis players lose, it's almost always true, and you can often see it quite dramatically, how the player loses to themselves, right? There's that place in the game where, points won against them, things missed, it just becomes too much and they can't bear it anymore and they start collapsing. And I mean, you literally can see it, right? And sometimes that person can rally and recover, and often not. But in some meaningful sense, that player loses to themselves, not to their opponent, not to take anything away from the opponent, but at that level of the game, and maybe this goes to Federer's point, when maybe we'll get Federer on the horn one a day and ask him, is these players are peers at their level of skill, and it's not that they're I mean it's not that there aren't some aren't this much better, so on and so on, but as we see play out all the time, somebody, a very junior player, a very young or inexperienced player, can dramatically upset a seasoned player who should have won the game
Mm.
by all accounts. And one of them had a better day, um, right?
Yeah.
At least vis-a-vis winning. But the other thing, which again, very apparent in tennis, but it's certainly got to be true in all sport. And I'm not a sport, again, a thing about which I'm at best a dilettante. Um, but if players, whether individual or team players, couldn't figure out how to always be beginning, they'd be lost. Because all it would take to end their career is one lost game,
Mm. Yeah.
right? But they
Yeah.
have to be starting again always,
Yeah.
even within a game,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, and again, so I think, this
Well,
is
that's
where,
interesting, isn't it? Because that, if it would seem that games like tennis, sports in general, are finite games. At the end, you declare somebody's won, somebody's lost. What you're making, the analogy you're making is that within that game, arguably, it's closer to an infinite game. But if we move to an infinite game, of the James Cast kind, and life is
yep,
certainly uh, an infinite game, then actually there has to be, because there's never any definitive result. You're always beginning. I'm thinking of the chair game, which is one of the most compelling games I know, which is a kind of way of generating a complex adaptive system, and it's always beginning again. And so it never actually ends, because you decide to stop at some point because you get tired, or hungry, or whatever. And I think that's part of why it's such a compelling and such an extraordinary game, is this sense of, yeah, we are kind of always beginning. And the same is true in our relationships, right? Every day. Um,
yeah.
it,
And I think, if we move from sport to work, this is, I mean, I think the sports examples give us a way of showing that this idea of a practice of beginning is not an esoteric, sort of frivolous concern.
mm,
The idea of practice, of having and building a practice, um, is part of what accounts for how people um, succeed at certain kinds of things, right? Um, Including, right, how some people are incredibly skillful at working with all kinds of different people, as opposed to just this small set of people that they know, on all kinds of different projects and problems. And so, when we talked last week, we were talking about the fact that um, the idea of certain kinds of thinking, and certain kinds of work and practice, um, are actually quite uncommon in the world of work. And like, there are understandable reasons for this. And I think, one of the big ones is, this bad mental model we have, that by the time that people get to work, they've finished what they
yeah,
need to learn in
right.
order to be at work, right? I mean, so we time box, in this sort of linear way, how our education is meant to go, to the point of some sort of, nominal qualification,
Yeah.
after which we're not meant to need to learn anymore, which, of course, we all know is ridiculous. But when you think of in work, what kind of space is made for learning and practice? Not much. It seems
I
to
think
me.
there's another thing as well. I think there's last week in the session, I was holding about how to facilitate, and we paid special attention to beginnings. I talked about not all time being equal, and I think that there's this intense time pressure in that world of work where we can't afford to mess around or to worry about
Mm-hmm.
the forming or the creation of a kind of rich, powerful, confident kind of a space where people can contribute their best because we're too keen to get on ahead. And of course, the trouble is that, well, there's lots of problems with that apart from the stress. I mean, actually, it slows you down, but also it means you might pursue goals or objectives that actually are perhaps not the ones that would serve you best because you've kind of already determined them. Whereas, I remember a story about an organization that whose meetings were dragging on kind of endlessly, and people kept throwing all sorts of extra staff into any other business until the leader decided to allow them a proper check-in to actually talk about what was on their mind, what was coming up for them, without necessarily a view to solving it or resolving it, but just to hearing it. And all of a sudden, when he did that, then they dealt with what was on the agenda, and they didn't have this kind of dump of all this extra stuff, and so I think there's a kind of if one pays attention carefully, if one devotes a little bit of time, and it actually doesn't take much, to creating a kind of beginning in the way that Jeff Bezos has, but obviously that's not the only one, that's for particular purposes, then actually it can speed things up. And yet the culture is we've got to get on, and that's kind of really another unhelpful pressure in work, I think. It's like you try and win the set before you win the game or win the point. It's like, whoa, 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 we need to play here.
Yeah, and I guess, one of the places where I learned again another set of lessons about this was when I was working in the defense world and came to meet a lot of folks who had, I had a colleague who was an Air Force pilot. I had a bunch of colleagues who had been Special Forces operators, and came to know more and more about both their training and their work. And, especially in the case of Special Forces operators, one, there's a very high ratio of non-deployed to deployed time in the life of a special forces operator, right? Deployment is intensive, focused, sometimes only lasting for hours,
Yeah.
right? And under extremely uncertain, pressurized, adverse conditions. So when you think about, and when people do think about and design for what it means and what it looks like to prepare people to be in those conditions, and when in those conditions to be able to perform at the absolute peak and limit of their ability, and not just not only individually but collectively. And surprise, what is most of the time of such people spent doing? Practicing.
Mhm.
And not only practicing in the limited way in which people might think, like target shooting and various other kinds of sort of physical repetitive practice, but learning. Because again, especially in special forces, but it's a very common thing, for example, in aviation, in military aviation, is these structures for learning constantly from what we're doing. So every deployment of military aircraft by pilots starts with a mission briefing, what we're going to be doing before we get in planes. You can imagine how that's important to get straight on what we're going to be doing. But absolutely, as important, if not more so, is the after action, which is after coming back from the mission. Pilots get together and they talk about what happened, right? And on the one hand, that's meant as a debrief on the mission, make people aware of what they didn't see, what they weren't part of, and so on, so that they can learn from what they weren't involved in, and although proximate to. But also that makes available learning that can go beyond this group.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like I don't can sound like a kind of slightly skewed comparison, but in a way, the world of improv theater is very similar. So when I first started working with improvisational theater, the kind of pretty much every client would say, "Oh, great, I don't have to prepare you to prepare. I don't have to pay you to prepare then." Because the assumption is that you improvise out of nothing. And that's absolutely not the case. And so the language that we developed in order to, because that question was predictable, um, the language we developed to say, well, you prepare a territory, not a path. Um,
Mm.
and so you don't prepare for specific outcomes because you can't predict what they are. You develop a capacity which you do through kind of playful practice, through engaging in the kind of things that you will be doing on stage, or to apply it to everyday life, which is what I do. You use the games to act as a little laboratory to try stuff out that you'll be doing in everyday life, in a meeting or in a conversation to do with work. What's really interesting for me is that, early on, this is like 25 years ago when I first started developing this, I kind of articulated my own version of these practices, and I very deliberately call them practices, not principles, and not not. There are tools and frameworks separate from this, but for me, the heart of it was this practice, this re kind of repeatable, deepening, ongoing, never-ending kind of work. Um, and what I noticed pretty soon was that there wasn't much more of that. There was quite a simple set of practices, and that actually the kind of the novelty, the value, the benefit came from having a simple, short, small set of ideas to return to, uh, when met by a kind of variable, new, novel context. So
Yep.
the novelty wasn't provided by having new practices. So how do you meet uncertainty, change, novelty? Well, you can't know what the detailed practices are in advance because otherwise it wouldn't be novel, right? So again, to go back to pilots, there's checklists and things like that. Things they need to know they check on the plane. But when they're doing an after action review, they're looking for a deeper, higher level of learning than that. And it's the same with kind of with my work is that I have not much to offer you in the way of ideas, but quite a lot of opportunity then to practice and to then reflect upon that practice and to see, well, how did these ideas play out there and what was different and what, you know, but there's virtue in the economy of the practice itself, that practices don't need to be necessarily complex in order for you to keep learning from them for, in my case, decades. I still learn
Mhm.
from practices that I've been wielding, and that sounds like kind of like I'm a slow learner or that I've failed, both of which would be reasonable interpretations seen from one. But actually, more importantly, and putting my own kind of vanity to one side, it's not really about that. It's the power of a really simple practice to keep meeting events, to keep helping you, and and that's
Yeah,
the beginning again.
yeah, and this is one of the things, that is so exciting about living when we're living, because I think that there has never been a time when the possibility of um, of having access to practice, the experience of people with deep practice, um, uh, has been so available. So, I had an extraordinary experience, opportunity, which is that the magician and historian of magic, Ricky Jay, did something really, really unusual, which is he was talked into hosting a weekend in which he would talk to people about about magic, and it was a full weekend. It was quite expensive, and it was limited to about 100 people, which sounds like a lot of people. Didn't feel like that many, but it was in this tiny town on the Hudson, about an hour north of New York City, um, and he had invited all kinds of people, most of whom he had collaborated with in one way or another. And the invitation and the structure of the thing, which drove about half the people batshit crazy, was that all of these people had been invited to come to talk about their practice. So some had hoped for and were expecting a lot of magic show, a lot of being taught tricks, and behind the scenes kind of thing. And they were all furious because on top of everything else, people were told that one of the core agreements of the weekend was that people were not allowed to perform uh, even casually tricks for each other. Um, anyway, on the other hand, what the weekend actually offered was this extraordinary opportunity to learn about the practice of these people with amazing gifts and experience. I learned more in that weekend about many many things than I learned in half of my graduate education. But one of the things was precisely the power of this optic of practice on the one hand, and um, how to both attend to what a practice is, and how to find a way into it. And again, there's an inevitable thing that faces anyone who wants to be part of a practice, which is they have to begin.
Mm.
They have to begin somewhere. And I think what keeps many of us out of practice and of all of the benefits that any kind of practice has to offer is that people never figure out how to begin.
Mm.
Uh, and that so if there's a problem that I'm interested in exploring, if not solving, with this idea of a practice of beginning, it's precisely to explore that dilemma.
That's beautiful. And this is us attempting to practice what we preach, to eat our own dog food, to kind of go, well, rather than plan or sketch out, we decided to begin by beginning. So this is our first exploration, and I imagine that this will lead in some way to some kind of invitation. Maybe not. We'll see. Um,
Yeah,
but um, but yeah, I think it'd be great to just kind of to pause there on that problem that you describe, and to see then kind of what emerges from this beginning.
yeah, yeah. Great, great. Thanks again, always for the conversation. And yeah, let's see where it leads.
Great. Thanks a lot.